Everyone keeps pointing at William. Every article, every royal commentator, every YouTube video in your feed, they all say the same thing. William is the one blocking Harry. William won't budge. William is the problem. And maybe that's true. Maybe William is furious. Maybe he hasn't forgiven his brother for a single word of that book. But here's what nobody is talking about. What if William isn't the one making the final call? What if the person who actually has the most to lose, the person who was publicly humiliated in front of hundreds of millions of people, the person who sat in silence while the world debated whether she was a liar or a villain, what if that person is Catherine, Princess of Wales, future queen, and the one woman in that palace who has never once said publicly how she really feels about what Harry did to her? We talk about Harry and William like this is a brother's story, but this has always been a four-person story. And one of those four people has been very, very quiet. Today we're not talking about William's anger. We're talking about Kate's wound. Because those are two completely different things, and only one of them can actually be healed. Stay with me, because what I'm about to walk you through changed the way I see this entire situation. Let's go back. Not to the headlines, not to the palace statements. Let's go back to the moment this really started, and why it cut so deep for Catherine specifically. It's March 2021. Harry and Meghan are sitting across from Oprah Winfrey in a garden in California. The world is watching. Roughly 17 million people in the US alone tune in. Another 11 million in the UK. This is not a quiet interview. This is a detonation. And then Meghan says something that seems, on the surface, like a small detail. She says the story that went around, the one that said she made Kate cry, wasn't true. No, she tells Oprah. The reverse happened. And just like that, Kate Middleton, who had said nothing, who had defended nothing, who had stayed completely silent through months of tabloid speculation, became, in front of the entire world, the woman who made the bride cry before the wedding. Think about what that actually means. Not as a royal, not as a future queen, as a person. You have spent years being painted as cold, as stiff, as too formal, and then suddenly you're painted as the villain in someone's love story, in her love story, on global television, and you have no right of reply, no press conference, no Instagram, nothing. You just have to sit there and take it. And the man who sat next to Meghan while she said it? That was Kate's brother-in-law, someone she had known for over a decade, someone she had watched grow up in that family alongside William, someone she thought, on some level, was family. If that feels personal to you, it should, because it was. But here's where it gets even more specific. Because the Oprah interview was one moment. Then came the book. In January 2023, Spare hits shelves. And Harry doesn't just reference the crying story, he goes into detail. Texts, specific words. Charlotte's dress being too big, too long, too baggy. Charlotte bursting into tears at home trying it on. Kate insisting the dresses be remade entirely. 4 days before the wedding. Now, you can debate who was right about the dress. Honestly, that's not the point. The point is that those were private text messages between two women trying to navigate a stressful situation. And Harry put them in a book. Published. Sold in every airport, every bookstore, every online retailer on the planet. Kate never agreed to that. She was never asked. She had no say. And here's the part that I think gets lost when we talk about this as a political or institutional story. Kate is a mother. She is raising 3 children in the public eye, under extraordinary pressure, with almost zero room for error. And in that book, her daughter Charlotte is described crying at a dress fitting before a wedding she was in as a toddler. That's not politics. That's not about the monarchy. That is someone putting your child in a book without your permission. If you're a parent watching this right now, I think you know exactly how that lands. And if you've ever had something private, something painful, something you said in a difficult moment thrown back at you publicly by someone you trusted, then you understand why this isn't something you just move past because it's been 2 years, or 3 years, or 5. Some things don't have an expiration date. And that, right there, is the foundation of everything we're going to talk about today. Because Balmoral is not just a castle. It's not just a location on a map in Scotland. For Catherine, It's something much more specific than that. And to understand why an invitation to Harry changes everything for her personally, you need to understand what that place actually means to her. That's exactly where we're going next. Let's talk about Balmoral. Because when most people hear that word, they picture a postcard. A grey Scottish castle, misty hills, the royal family in tweed, walking dogs across the grounds. A tradition. A backdrop. But for Catherine, Balmoral is something that took years to earn. Think about her timeline for a second. She and William started dating in 2003 at university. They broke up, got back together. For years, she existed in this strange in-between space. The girlfriend, the almost fiancée, the woman the tabloids called Weighty Katie because the ring hadn't come yet. And through all of that, access to Balmoral wasn't guaranteed. It wasn't automatic. The royal family doesn't just open the gates to anyone. Balmoral is where the queen went to be private, to be a grandmother, not a monarch. To be surrounded only by people who had truly been accepted into the inner circle. Getting invited there, really invited, staying there, being part of the family rhythm of that place, that was a signal. It meant you were trusted. It meant you belonged. For Catherine, getting to that point was a journey. And when she finally got there, when she was fully, genuinely part of those summers in Scotland, walking those same hills, sitting in those same rooms where Diana had once sat, where Philip had once sat, where every chapter of this family's private history had been written, that meant something profound to her. This is where her children learned to love the countryside. George, Charlotte, Louis, Balmoral is woven into their childhood in a way that almost nothing else is. It's the place where the family exhales, where the protocol drops slightly, where they are, as much as royals can ever be, just a family. And that intimacy is exactly what makes the question of Harry's invitation so loaded for her. Because you have to understand, Balmoral isn't Buckingham Palace. It isn't a formal state occasion where you can maintain distance, where there are hundreds of staff and schedules and events creating natural buffers between people. Balmoral is close. It's dinners together. It's mornings at breakfast. It's walks where there's nowhere to hide behind ceremony. If Harry comes to Balmoral, Catherine cannot avoid him. There is no diplomatic distance. There is no formal arrangement where they're in the same building but separate wings, separate schedules, separate worlds. It's family, concentrated, intimate, unavoidable. And what does that actually ask of her? It asks her to sit across a dinner table from the man who put her private text messages in a book. The man who, while sitting next to his wife on global television, allowed a narrative to stand, even be amplified, that cast Kate as the woman who made a bride cry. The man who described her daughter in tears in a fitting room. It asks her to smile, to be gracious, to be the bigger person, because that's what royals do. That's what Catherine has trained herself to do for her entire adult life. You hold it together. You present the face that the institution needs you to present. You do not let the cracks show. But here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. How many times can you be asked to be the bigger person before that starts to cost you something real? There's a particular kind of exhaustion that comes from being publicly wronged and privately expected to absorb it. To not react, to not defend yourself, to trust that the world will eventually figure out the truth on its own, while the other person goes on podcasts, writes books, does Netflix documentaries, and keeps the story alive. Catherine has done every interview where she was gracious. She has attended every event where she was composed. She has raised 3 children in the spotlight without once using them as a weapon or a shield or a storyline. And in all of that time, she has never, not once, publicly said what Harry did to her, what it felt like, what it cost her. Because she can't. Because the institution doesn't allow it. Because her role doesn't permit the kind of public processing that Harry has made into an entire career. So she holds it, quietly, privately. And Balmoral is the one place where she doesn't have to perform that composure for cameras, for press, for the public. Except, if Harry is there, she does. Even in the most private place the royal family has, she would have to be the version of herself that absorbs everything and shows nothing. Royal commentators who have spoken to people close to the Wales household have consistently noted that Catherine's position on Harry's return isn't driven by bitterness or a desire to punish. It's driven by something quieter and harder than anger. It's about what she would have to give up, again, to make his return possible. And that brings us to the part of this story that I think is the most underreported, the most misunderstood, and honestly the most human thing about this entire situation. She never got an apology. Not a real one. Not a private one that we know of. Not a public one that matched the scale of what was said. Harry has spoken about wanting reconciliation. He has spoken about missing his family. He has spoken about the door being open on his side. But he has never, in any interview, any statement, any public moment, looked directly at what he put Catherine through and said, "I was wrong. I am sorry." Specifically, by name, for the dress story, for the texts, for putting my niece's crying face into a chapter of my memoir. And without that, what exactly is Catherine being asked to welcome back into her family's most sacred space? That is not a small question. That is, I would argue, the question. And it's the one nobody in the royal commentary space is actually asking, because it's easier to frame this as William's pride versus Harry's hurt feelings than to look at the woman who has been silently carrying the weight of this for years. She is not a footnote in this story. She is the center of it. And the more you sit with that, the more the whole picture shifts. Because if Catherine is the key, if her position is what's actually holding this door closed, then the question isn't whether Charles will send an invitation. The question is whether Harry is even capable of doing what it would take to earn one. We're going to get into exactly that. But first, I need to talk about the gap between how Kate appears in public and what the people closest to this situation say is actually happening behind closed doors. Because that gap is significant, and it tells you everything about why this isn't resolving itself anytime soon. There's a version of Catherine that the world sees every day. Polished. Warm. Engaged. She shows up to children's hospitals and crouches down to eye level. She laughs at garden parties. She holds her husband's hand on the steps of cathedrals. She has, by almost every public measure, mastered the art of being exactly what the monarchy needs her to be at exactly the right moment. And that version of Catherine is real. It's not a performance in the cynical sense. She has genuinely committed herself to this role in a way that even her harshest critics acknowledge. But there is another version, one that doesn't get photographed. Royal insiders and commentators who have tracked this family closely have noted, consistently and repeatedly, that Catherine processes things slowly. She is not someone who reacts in the moment. She watches, she waits. She forms a view over time, and once that view is formed, it is extremely difficult to shift. Think about the pattern. When the Oprah interview aired in March 2021, Catherine said nothing. Not a statement, not a leaked reaction, nothing. The palace issued a brief, careful line about the issues raised being taken seriously. And Kate? Silence. When Spare was published in January 2023, she said nothing again. She attended engagements. She smiled. She wore a blue coat to a school visit 2 days after the book dropped and answered questions about children's literacy, while the entire world was dissecting her private text messages. That is not weakness. Do not mistake that for weakness. That is the kind of control that takes years to build, and it is exactly the kind of control that tells you, this person has not let this go. They have decided to carry it differently, quietly, on their own terms. Because here's the thing about people who don't publicly fall apart. The feelings don't disappear. They compact. They become something denser and harder and more load-bearing than anything that gets cried out in an interview or shouted in an argument. Catherine has been carrying this for years. And if you pay close attention, not to what she says, but to what she doesn't say, to where she is and isn't, to the specific shape of her silences, you start to see it. She and Meghan have not had a single confirmed direct interaction since the Queen's funeral in September 2022. That is nearly 4 years. Think about that. These are two women who were, at least technically, sisters-in-law, who shared a family, who stood together at public occasions for years. 4 years of documented distance. And that distance didn't happen by accident. It didn't happen because of scheduling conflicts or logistical complications. It happened because someone decided, quietly, firmly, without drama, that this is where the line is. Now bring Harry into that picture, Because Harry is not a separate issue from Meghan. You cannot invite Harry to Balmoral and have it be a clean, surgical reconnection between brothers and father and son. Harry and Meghan are a unit. What happens with Harry has implications for Meghan, and what has implications for Meghan has implications for Catherine in ways that go far beyond one summer in Scotland. Royal sources who have spoken to various outlets over the past year have painted a picture of Catherine's position that is notably consistent. She is not opposed to reconciliation in the abstract. She is not a vindictive person by nature. She is not trying to punish Harry for the rest of his life. But she needs something first. She needs what anyone who has been publicly wronged needs before they can genuinely move forward. She needs acknowledgement. Not forgiveness. She's already doing the work of that privately because that's who she is. But acknowledgement from Harry that what he did caused real damage. That the dress story, told the way it was told, was not fair to her. That putting her private words in a book without her knowledge or consent was wrong. That allowing his daughter to be described in tears in a published memoir and calling it truth-telling had a cost that he has never fully reckoned with. Without that, reconciliation isn't reconciliation, it's just proximity. And proximity, sitting at the same dinner table in a Scottish castle, walking the same grounds, pretending that 3 years of public humiliation can be dissolved by a shared weekend, that is not healing, that is performance. And Catherine has performed enough. What makes this particularly complex, and this is the part that gets almost no coverage, is that Harry's entire public positioning makes it nearly impossible for him to give her what she needs. His brand, his identity, his commercial value in America, all of it is built on the narrative of him and Meghan as the wronged parties. The ones who left because they had no choice. The ones who spoke because the institution left them no option. The ones who were the victims of the very family they're now being asked to rejoin. If Harry comes out tomorrow and says, "I was wrong about Kate, I handled that badly, the way I told that story was unfair to her," he doesn't just apologize to a sister-in-law. He chips away at the entire architecture of everything he has built since 2020. And he knows that. Catherine knows that. William knows that. Charles knows that. Which means the apology that would change everything is also the apology that costs Harry the most to give. That is not a simple problem. That is a knot that has been tightening for years. And the question of a Balmoral invitation pulls directly on that knot. Some people, when they watch Catherine at public events, so composed, so present, so apparently untouched by any of this, wonder whether she has simply moved past it, whether time and distance have done the work that words couldn't. I don't think that's right. I think what you're watching when you watch Catherine in those moments is someone who has made a decision. A deliberate, conscious, hard-won decision to not let what was done to her define how she shows up in the world. That is different from being over it. That is someone who chose, every single day, to be bigger than the situation. Not because the situation was small, but because she decided, for her own reasons, for her children's reasons, for the institution's reasons, that she would not let it shrink her. And if you've ever had to make that choice, to keep showing up with grace for something that genuinely hurt you, then you know how much that costs. You know that the energy required to hold yourself together in the face of that is not nothing. It is enormous, and it is ongoing. Catherine is still paying that price. Every time Harry's name comes up in a briefing, every time a new report surfaces about reconciliation talks, every time someone asks William, in a carefully worded question at a public engagement, whether the brothers are speaking. She is still in it, every time. And the idea that she would simply open the doors of the most personal place her family has, the place where her children play, where she and William are most themselves, where there is no ceremony to hide behind, and do that without any of the things she actually needs? That's not grace. That would be self-erasure. And Catherine, the real Catherine, the one who has navigated this institution with more quiet steel than she has ever given credit for, is not going to erase herself for anyone. Not even for a king who wants his family back together. Which brings us to the part of this story that I think matters most. Not what happened in the past, not who said what in which book, but what would actually have to change, right now, today, in 2026, for any of this to move. Because there is a path. It's narrow. It requires something specific from Harry that he has never shown any sign of being willing to give. But it exists. And that's where we're going next. Let's be honest about something. Reconciliation in this family has been described as close so many times that the word has almost lost its meaning. Every few months, a new source, a new insider, a new royal commentator surfaces with a variation of the same headline. Talks are progressing, both sides want resolution, there is hope. And then nothing happens. Not because people aren't trying. Charles, by all credible accounts, genuinely wants his son back. He is a father who is aging, who has faced serious illness, who understands, perhaps better than anyone, that time is not a renewable resource. The reports coming out of the palace consistently describe a king who is willing to meet Harry more than halfway. But here's what those reports almost never address directly. Wanting reconciliation and being willing to pay the price of it are two completely different things, and the price, the real price, runs directly through Catherine. So let's talk about what would actually have to happen. Not in a fairy tale version of this story, in a realistic one. The first thing, and this is non-negotiable from everything we know about Catherine's position, is a private acknowledgement from Harry. Not a press release. Not a carefully worded statement drafted by a communications team in California. A direct, personal, private acknowledgement to Catherine that the dress story was handled unfairly. That the texts were private and should have stayed that way. That whatever the truth of that situation was, she deserved better than having it published in a memoir that sold millions of copies worldwide. That conversation has, as far as anyone knows, never happened. Harry has spoken in general terms about regrets. He has said publicly that he misses his family. He has said the door is open on his side. But specific, direct, personal accountability to Catherine, by name, for specific actions, that is a gap that has never been closed. And that gap is not small. It is the gap. The second thing is harder to define, but just as important. There needs to be some signal, some credible, consistent signal that the era of public storytelling about this family is over. Not just paused, over. Because here's Catherine's calculation, and it's a rational one. If Harry comes to Balmoral this summer, what is the guarantee that the visit doesn't become material? What prevents a future interview, a future project, a future memoir from including a chapter about the summer they all sat around the dinner table in Scotland and tried to pretend everything was fine? There is no legal guarantee. There is no contractual protection. There is only trust. And trust, once it has been broken at that specific level, not just between two people in a room, but on global television, in a best-selling book, in a Netflix documentary, does not come back because someone sends a warm letter or makes a phone call. Trust comes back through time and through proof. Through a sustained period where actions consistently match words. Where the private stays private. Where the family is not a content strategy. Has Harry demonstrated that? Over the past year or two, there have been fewer public broadsides. The most aggressive chapter of the Sussex media offensive does seem to have quieted somewhat. But quieter is not the same as done. And Catherine knows the difference. The third thing, and this is the one that almost nobody talks about, is that any genuine reconciliation has to account for the children. George, Charlotte, and Louis are growing up. George is not far from an age where he will start to understand, if he doesn't already, the full shape of what happened between his father's family and his uncles. He will read things. He will hear things. He will ask questions. And Charlotte, whose dress fitting was described in detail in a published book when she was a toddler, who couldn't consent to being in anyone's story, will one day read that chapter herself. Catherine is not just protecting herself when she holds this line. She is protecting her children's ability to grow up with some boundary between their private lives and the public narrative that has been constructed around their family. That is not obstruction. That is motherhood. And any reconciliation that doesn't genuinely address that dimension, that treats the children as incidental, as background, as people who will simply adapt to whatever the adults decide, is not a real reconciliation. It's a photo opportunity. Now, here's where it gets genuinely complicated, because everything I've just described, the private acknowledgement, the end of public storytelling, the protection of the children, none of that is unreasonable. None of it is vindictive. None of it asks Harry to be someone he isn't or to deny what he experienced. It just asks him to take full responsibility for the collateral damage of how he chose to share it. And the tragedy, and I use that word deliberately because that is what this is, the tragedy is that Harry seems to genuinely want his family back. The reports of him pushing for Balmoral, of wanting a private meeting with Charles, of approaching this summer with something that looks like renewed urgency, those don't read like the actions of someone who has closed the door. They read like the actions of someone who misses home. But missing home and doing the work to earn your way back into it are not the same journey. And what stands between Harry and home, not William's pride, not palace politics, not Charles's hesitation, what actually stands there is a debt he has never paid. To a woman who has never publicly asked him to pay it, who has never leveraged it, weaponized it, or used it as a bargaining chip, who has simply, quietly, held her line. There is something almost unbearably human about that. On both sides, Harry, circling back, Catherine, holding still, neither of them able to fully close the distance. And a castle in Scotland sitting at the center of it all, waiting to see which of them blinks first. But here's the question that I keep coming back to, and it's the one I want to leave you with as we get to the final part of this. Is there a version of this where Catherine changes her position? Not because she has to, not because she's pressured into it, but because something genuinely shifts. Because Harry does something, says something, gives something, that makes her decide the cost of keeping the door closed is higher than the cost of opening it. I think there might be. I think it's narrow. I think it requires something from Harry that he has never shown any sign of being ready to give. But I don't think it's impossible. And the reason I don't think it's impossible brings us to the very last piece of this story. The part about what this is really about, underneath all of the politics and the history and the headlines. It's about whether two people, both of whom loved the same family from different angles, can find a way to let something be over. Let's talk about what that would look like. Let's strip everything back. No palace sources, no royal commentators, no insider briefings, no carefully worded statements from communications teams on either side of the Atlantic. Just the human architecture of this situation. A father who is ill and aging and wants his son home. A son who left wounded and is circling back, uncertain of his welcome. A brother who feels betrayed in ways that go beyond words. And a woman, composed, private, steel-spined, who was caught in the crossfire of someone else's war and has been paying for it ever since. That's the story. That's always been the story. And the question of whether Catherine changes her position, whether the door to Balmoral opens, whether this family finds its way back to something that resembles wholeness, ultimately comes down to something that no palace briefing can manufacture and no royal commentator can predict. It comes down to whether Harry is capable of a specific kind of courage. Not the courage of leaving, he demonstrated that. Not the courage of speaking publicly, he has done that more than most people would ever choose to. The courage I'm talking about is the quieter, harder kind. The kind that doesn't get a documentary, doesn't get a chapter in a book, doesn't get applause from anyone. The courage of going to someone you hurt, privately, without cameras, without an audience, and saying, "I see what I did. I see what it cost you. I'm sorry." Not because it helps my image, not because it moves the reconciliation forward strategically, but because it was wrong and you deserved better, and that is simply the truth. That conversation, if it ever happened, would never be reported. We would never know. There would be no headline, no source, no confirmation. Catherine would never speak about it publicly. Harry almost certainly wouldn't either. It would just be two people in a room, finally saying the thing that has needed to be said for years. And then? Maybe nothing changes immediately. Maybe the walls don't come down overnight. Maybe Balmoral this summer is still not the right moment, and Charles has to accept that his timeline and the timeline of genuine healing are not the same. But something would shift. Something underneath the surface of all of this. The part that never gets photographed. The part that can't be briefed about or spun or explained in a 2-minute segment. Something in that foundation would begin to change. Because here's what I believe, after following this story for as long as I have. Catherine is not trying to win. She is not keeping score. She is not waiting for Harry to lose something before she agrees to forgive. That is not who she is. Every credible account of her character, from people who have worked with her and been close to this family, describes someone who is fundamentally decent, who values family, who understands, better than anyone, what it means to hold something together when the forces pulling it apart are immense. She does not want this rift. She never wanted it. She just needs it to be real when it ends. Not convenient, not managed, not timed to coincide with a positive news cycle or a public rehabilitation strategy. Real. And maybe, if you believe that people are capable of genuine growth, if you believe that the version of Harry who is now a father himself, who is raising his own children in their own version of an extraordinary life, has access to a kind of understanding he didn't have at 36 when he was writing that book, maybe that conversation is closer than any of us can see from the outside. Or maybe it isn't. Maybe the gap stays. Maybe Balmoral this summer is, once again, a castle full of almost reconciled, almost healed, almost whole. I genuinely don't know. I don't think anyone does. But I know this. The invitation that matters most in this story is not the one Charles may or may not send to Harry. It's the one Harry has to send to Catherine. An acknowledgement, a reckoning, a genuine reaching across the distance he created. And until that invitation exists, written in private, delivered without an audience, asked for nothing in return, the gates of Balmoral are going to stay exactly where Catherine needs them to be. Closed. Not forever, maybe, but closed. Now I want to hear from you, because this is genuinely one of those situations where I think reasonable people land in completely different places. Do you think Harry is capable of giving Catherine what she actually needs? Not the public gestures, not the general statements about wanting peace, but the specific, private, direct accountability that would actually mean something to her? Drop your answer in the comments. I read every single one. And if this video made you think about this story differently, if it shifted something in how you see Catherine's role in all of this, share it with someone who's been following the royal drama, because I promise you, most people have never considered this angle. And that conversation is worth having. I'll see you in the next one.